So again, good day to everyone wherever you are. So we're going to have a workshop. It's on race, caste, ethnicity-based discrimination in wage setting. And we have an expert today. Let me just remind everyone about our format for today. So we'll ask our speaker to give a brief opening remarks, basically updating the lecture for this topic. And then we'll have a discussion. There's at least 2 questions prepared. We're going to ask her, and then after each question, we can open the floor for questions, queries from the participants in the workshop. Okay, so just keep your microphones muted unless, of course, you're going to ask a question. So for today, we have Archana Prasad. She's a professor in the Center for the Informal Sector and Labor Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. So welcome, Archana.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for a start, can we ask you for maybe some brief remarks on the topic?
Thank you, Benji and Edira and all the participants. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming in. Yeah, it's good.
And all the participants for taking the time out for this workshop. I'm very happy to interact with you on this very important topic. This note was prepared about 4 or 5 years ago when we had the workshop for this course and the recording for this course. And but I feel that some of the issues raised in this course remain much the same. If not, their relevance has only deepened in the contemporary period. One of the issues, I think, that we did not sort of raise in this note so far has been the extreme deregulation of labor within the contemporary world, including the developed world. And that deregulation, in fact, creates conditions for deepening of discrimination as well. So this factor needs to be kept in mind, especially with the informalization, the greater informalization and flexibility of working conditions. For example, in my country, we have labor law reforms now. And in these labor law reforms, we have the hire and fire policy that is being promoted so that the employer can get some flexibility as to how much and who to hire. And we feel that this basically reduces the bargaining power of labor to a very considerable extent, and therefore also leads to wage discrimination within the formal sector or the salaried sector, because anyway, the recruitment patterns in the salaried sector are very skewed. The second thing to note is that informalization, which is a systemic tendency of contemporary capitalism, is in fact deepening the already pre-existing inequalities. And that form of that deepening of inequalities reveals itself in wage discrimination. So it's not as a wage discrimination is the cause. It may be the cause also of certain things, but wage discrimination is the manifestation of a deeply rooted tendency within contemporary capitalism, because we know that capitalism all over the world after the Second World War took certain measures that were meant to officially at least remove discrimination. Even the ILO made many conventions. You had affirmative action policies, you had equal pay norms, and um, mm, and regulations in almost all countries of the world. And those were meant to even address what we call in popular language, so I'm not very happy with that term, but intersectional inequalities. So, for example, Black women will face a greater deal of discrimination than Black men, even though the wage gaps between white and Black would be, people of color would be very vast. Just before this workshop, I saw another paper emanating from the US itself, which argued that the combined index of wage discrimination of Black women and Latino women, the combined index is higher than the overall wage discrimination index. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we need to ask the question, what are the conditions under which this inequality is deepening, and whether this is simply a matter of taste or preference or comfort, which a lot of identity economics actually argues that the behavioral patterns of employers and employees, if they are similar, employers tend to choose people they are comfortable with. A lot of neoclassical economics actually argues that position. And what we, especially scholars from the South, have been doing is countering that position by showing what are the uneven distributional impacts of contemporary development. And these uneven distributional impacts are also reflected in wage discrimination. Yeah, and these impacts are also mediated by institutions to which capitalism itself adapts when it first starts building in different cultures and societies. So it sort of remolds institutions in order to suit its own accumulation strategy. So therefore, we feel that many of us feel that actually wage discrimination is a systemic tendency. Like wage theft, wage discrimination is also a systemic tendency of contemporary capitalism, because its renewal is based on the deepening of inequalities itself, on the deepening of inequalities itself. So I feel that perhaps we should give little more attention to the changing forms of employment in the contemporary post-pandemic and post-depression period, where people are arguing for self-employment. Now, if you have self-employment, generally, people would argue that there's no scope for wage discrimination. But then we need to unearth the character of that self-employment and why certain groups are hauled into low-end employment, behaving like what we like to call disguised wage labor. Yeah, in the sense that they are appearing to be independent producers, but are not really independent producers. For example, I can give you a good example of home workers in my country, where women from minority section are largely doing highly skilled home-based work. Yeah. So this discrimination is basically a result of how capitalism molds and is also molded by existing social institutions. So those identities are basically a manifestation of that process of negotiation and adaptation by capital itself. And why is it able to do that? It's basically able to do that because you have a burgeoning distress labor force. And especially, I can say in countries of the South, actually, labor power doesn't have too many places to go to. And when a worker is not able to get work in the times of economic distress, their negotiation capacity is very low. The negotiation capacity. One thing is to talk about discrimination. When you have enough jobs and the worker has a choice to move. Yeah. So in that case, the negotiating power of the worker will be much higher. But we see that that kind of situation almost doesn't exist anywhere. I don't know, it may be a few European countries, but I don't see that happening also because even in those countries, if you look at universities, their situation is worse than ours. People working 3 times a week, working in 4 offices and doing all that. So the whole austerity plan is just going to basically widen the inequalities. I think I'll stop there and take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Archana, for that discussion, updating what has been discussed in the video. I actually have a prepared question for Archana, but she already answered it in her remarks. So I'll just open the floor for any questions from our participants for today. So I would have asked Archana about basically clarifying the roots of wage discrimination, but this has already been discussed by Archana. So maybe any of our participants here have anything to ask? Yeah, Edlira.
Yeah, just a quick question following up on what you just discussed, Archana. You mentioned that you are not very comfortable or you don't like that much the term intersectional inequality. Did I understand that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you can tell us why so.
Well, I don't have any problem with saying that inequalities can be manifold and have multiple sources, and they can interact with each other to produce a particular type of inequality. But the intersectionality literature is more about identity. That's my problem with it. It's more about identity, discussing identities as equal. Whereas what we are talking about is the systemic tendency within capitalism that actually gives rise to those identities also. So, we feel that it's maybe an accurate descriptive position, but analytically speaking, it doesn't really explain why, explain that the discrimination faced by an upper class scheduled caste person or a lower caste person who is economically relatively better off or working in a government office, the form of that discrimination is quite different from one being faced by a lower caste woman in agricultural fields. Yeah. So the conditions of discrimination also determine its forms, basically. And the identities are a manifestation of their form. So the articulation of the identity also will not be similar in that case. So I just feel that the intersectional discourse doesn't really take care of the complexity of the problem. It also treats the capital-labor relation, which is at the heart of wage discrimination. It treats that relation as an identity. That's my whole problem. So that identity is the same as identity of color, is the same as identity of gender, you know, and they all come together and produce something. Yeah. But that capital labor relation itself produces that capital labor relation itself generates certain types of conflicting identities amongst the same social group, which has many classes within it also. Yeah. So that's why I feel that that terminology doesn't really capture the complexity of the issue. That's all.
Yeah. So thank you, Archana, for the reply to Edlira. So any question from our participants? So while we're waiting, just to follow up on that, Archana, so you mean by going back to that question about intersectionality? So are you saying then that like the wage, the capital and labor relationship is like a key factor, and that in the intersectional analysis or in the identity politics discourse, the wage labor relations is just like at the same plane as the question of gender, the question of race. Is that a right understanding of what you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, it's sort of right, because it doesn't see that, you see, the wage labor relations is formed by a segmentation of the workforce. That segmentation is due to a key factor, which is the way in which capitalism adapts, or when capital comes somewhere or interacts with, expands itself, it adapts to its social conditions and alters its accumulation strategy. So the fact that 74% of the domestic workers in South Asia or 84% are women is not only because of their identity. It's there because the capital has remolded the institution of the family in a particular manner. And that gender division of labor makes these women what we call, I was hesitating to use that term, but the reserve army of labor, which means that they are workers in waiting. And they are considered workers in waiting because because of the privatization of the task of social reproduction itself. So it's always thought that because the reproduction of labor power, that is the upkeep or the nurturing, or what we popularly call the care economy just now, yeah, that is not a social responsibility, even though it keeps growing the supply of labor in the labor market. The very fact that that is considered in the private sphere makes structures the labor force in a particular way. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I think those are good insights to think about that question. So, but I see George hands has raised. So let me call on George.
Thank you, Betty. And thank you, Archana, for the presentation. Mine is not a question, but it's a comment. And it has to do with where I should not talk about how salary disparity comes about, or wage disparity comes when the employer has the right to decide what to pay whom. And that we experience in my country, Liberia, in the past regime under President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Because after the war, we had a total breakdown of system. There were the salary structures that were in place before could not commensurate with the cost of living. So there was the need to have a step up of salaries. So the government appealed to the international partners, and they had a pool fund where they will put some money and allotted to ministries and agencies, and the directors and the ministers were given the authority to decide how to compensate further the employees. Therefore, you will see that in one ministry, a minister will decide to give his or her secretary that much, and in another ministry, the director or the minister will decide to give this little, to the extent that some ministries were paying the minister's driver even more than some directors were being paid in other ministries and agencies. And unfortunately, we had a very weak labor center, a labor union system in the country. So they could not, really combat this situation to go on the table and negotiate in a way that will set a minimum wage that will be able to go across and mitigate this disparity in salary. And that is where my union fell into trouble with the government, because we were one group who saw the disparity in the health sector to be so vast, and we started to challenge it. There our trouble began. So it's really true that when there is no, say, a program, a certain say system to follow, and people have to to set salary arbitrarily based upon the decision of one person or a group of person, then you see disparity sets in. So thank you. I followed that well, Archana.
Yeah, thank you, George, for that comment. So he did say that it's not really a question, although if you do have any comment, Archana, but I think it was a post-conflict situation, right, in Liberia.
Yeah.
So yeah, Nicholas has his hands raised, so maybe Nico has a question.
Yes, well, I have a question. And unfortunately, I'm not taking active part of the course, so and I'm curious about the literature and your class, Archana. I have a question going back a bit with the name of the webinar, Race, Caste, and Ethnicity, and that you have insisted naming or associating your explanation to probably the particularities of the South Asia, or probably India in itself. But how far do you think this critical approach to the place of race, caste, and ethnicity, how far it can go to be a global explanation of the contemporary patterns of capital accumulation? Let me put my question in a different manner. I'm from Argentina. I think if we have interacted in a conference in Stockholm on home-based work, and I think that for the case of the Americas, where race obviously had a very particular relevance in the segmentation of the labor force, obviously due to the slave trade, but also because of the patterns and the ways the labor force was organized in relation to indigenous people, formerly slave people. And I want to know if your explanation is more like a regional explanation, or if you think that explanation giving much relevance to the capital itself, just adapting to the different circumstances, can be understood as a global pattern of capital. And I hope my question was, as it's a bit complex and also situated, I hope you can give a comment on that. Thank you very much.
Should I?
Yeah. Thank you, Nico. Yeah, Archana. Yeah.
So, thank you, Nico. Actually, I may have taken the example of South Asia. I also gave you some examples from North America for this. And the literature that I've read for Latin America through my colleagues in the Agrarian South Network and different parts of Africa, even China for that matter, it doesn't give you a very different story. Yeah, the proposition that I'm making is a more theoretical one, which is based on the immanent tendency of historical capitalism. Yeah, and that immanent tendency may reveal itself in different ways, in different contexts. But the immanent tendency of global capitalism is the same thumb rule to some extent. Yeah, the historical capitalism, as it has developed, has been uneven in its development. Even, I don't have to say, there are very great political economists who have studied this and said this for different parts of the world. So my explanation is based in the way in which capital expands itself. In South America, it will expand itself in a particular way. Yeah. So the wage hierarchy may reveal itself in a particular way. But my proposition is that that wage hierarchy is a manifestation of the existing hierarchy within the capital-labor relationship. And that segmentation in that capital-labor relationship, or the emergence of that class structure, is basically a result of the way in which capitalism may adapt to one phase of settler colonialism from another phase of settler colonialism, from pre-settler colonialism to another phase of settler colonialism. So the forms of discrimination will be different because there are different historical contexts. But the tendency remains one of deepening inequality. And I think almost all ILO reports and everybody is now acknowledging that tendency is a tendency of, is a global challenge. It's not a South Asian challenge. What I basically gave as an example of a lower caste person or a Dalit or a tribal indigenous person in India, the same indigeneity has different manifestations in Latin America, but that also faces discrimination unless you have an organized movement to fight it back. Yeah. And because of the emerging distress and the expansion of labor surpluses, the collective bargaining power of informal labor is becoming lesser. In fact, within Europe itself, informal labor, even salaried labor is losing its bargaining power because of the increase of this part-time work and all this kind of stuff. I think now I was seeing one of the EU reports in places where, intermittent part-time work or floating labor force was just 7 or 8%, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Now it's 31%. So the simple point that I'm making is that the crisis of capitalism is overcome by capitalism by adapting itself to emerging situations. And that adaptation leads to higher concentration and more inequalities. And wage discrimination is a manifestation of that. So this could happen in any context, whether it happens to a greater degree somewhere and a lesser degree somewhere. But I doubt that in countries of the South, particularly in places like Brazil, Mexico, I don't know about Argentina, you're from there, you can tell me, it happens. You don't have a scheduled caste. You have certain racial populations, majorities, who are actually treated in a different way. So I'm making the theoretical proposition and basically picking up examples from different places. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Archana. So I guess Nico doesn't have a follow-up, but from what I understand, I guess this is really the crux of the matter, the fact that capitalism meets in different countries pre-existing social differentiation, and capitalists take advantage of that, and that results in discrimination on the basis of race, caste, or any ethnicity, all for the purpose of increasing profit and accumulation. So yeah, so I don't know if I got it right. Archana is here, so anyway, again, another call. If any of our participants have a question, if none at the moment, maybe I can shift the discussion a bit from like the roots of the problem to like possible solutions. So Archana, a question. There's an article of Chandra Sekhar and Jayati Ghosh positing that NREGA in India had a positive impact on mitigating wage differentials between castes in India. Do you think such forms of social protection is one way to remediate discrimination on the basis of caste, race, and ethnicity? If yes or not, what would be other ways of dealing with wage discrimination?
See, I don't, MNREGS basically gives you a minimum wage. Okay. So obviously anybody who's working out of distress and is working on a minimum wage basis is getting some social protection. Yeah. But that's only for 100 days a year. Yeah. And we know that that protection is actually coming down. The people, when it first started, a household used to get about 70 days of employment under MNREGS. Now the average employment is 32 days. That's one person in a household. Yeah. So employment guarantee can only work as a protection if it is universal and it has good, robust regulation and monitoring. Yeah, good. In my view, in my consideration, the only way of removing the discrimination is first making sure that the distributional effects of employment and of social protection are evenly distributed according to the levels of deprivation. So universal means what? Universal means everybody should get social protection. But the people who have been historically deprived, so that means that historical discrimination has to be addressed in regulation. And in most places, affirmative action was largely confined to public programs. Yeah. And if you are going to disinvest in public programs, the discrimination is only going to grow. Because with that, you have the deregulation of capital also. Once you have the deregulation of capital and the informalization of employment, then so you need protection of the conditions of work. It's not merely social protection. social protection or social wage can address particular types of discrimination. Yeah, for example, socialization, social protection in terms of childcare, maternity care, all these things. It can go to some extent to address gender discrimination. But wage discrimination, which is not legal, which is basically market oriented, the deepening of the market and the existence of surplus labor means that the more you move towards full employment, the lesser the discrimination will be. Because the collective negotiation power of labor will be higher. Yeah? Will that happen in a capitalist system? I'm not so sure. So if you cannot do that, because as others must have already spoken about it, that the capitalist system relies on unemployment, open unemployment, for its what should I say, for its reproduction and expansion. It relies on wage depression rather than the expansion of the wage bill. Yeah. So if it relies on wage depression, it has to create surplus labor. As long as the reserve army of labor subsidizes capital and reduces the negotiation power of labor, discrimination is going to exist. So you need effective regulation rather than deregulation. You know, all the people who are arguing for labor law reforms in various countries were pointing out to their loopholes. What do governments go and do? Instead of plugging the loopholes, they do away with the laws altogether, mostly. I remember in GLU itself, we had lectures on the way in which England was making laws to deregulate unions or weaken unions. Yeah. And so I think wage setting has to be seen as a tripartite process of negotiation. Yeah. If you remove that tripartite system or you informalize it to an extent where there's no institutional mechanism for the workers to express their right, yeah, not have. Discrimination will not only exist on the basis of ethnicity and all this, it will exist on the basis of, as George was saying, individual whims and fancies. Yeah, but that individual whim and fancy is a result of not plugging the loopholes of an existing post-World War II system, but doing away with the system altogether.
Yeah, thank you, Archana, for that. So yeah, I get the point that even universal social protection really does not deal directly with the question of wage discrimination. And so I think we really have to go back to regulation, strengthening of unionization and collective bargaining. Of course, going to full employment will shift the balance in favor of labor in general, right? So,
but I don't want to be misread on this. I think universal social protection is good; it's essential. But will it deal with the problem of discrimination? I'm not so sure.
Yeah,
it will help. It will take the burden of it. It will basically address the problems of survival and livelihood, maybe some security, and increase the collective bargaining power. But will it stop capital from discriminating? I'm not so sure. Unless you stop capital, the only remote way in which it can do is it can increase the bargaining power of labor. But
yeah. Yeah, I guess even going back to that article that I mentioned, they really just said mitigate it. It mitigated like the wage differentials. Of course, it doesn't say that it's the solution to discrimination. Yeah. So yeah, so I call the call on the participants if anybody has a question. Yeah, Edlira, and then after that, Nico. Yeah.
No, let Nicholas go first, please.
Yeah, Nico.
Okay, well, thank you again. Well, I'm not familiar with the literature that Benji was mentioning, but I am familiar a bit with the Nigeria, well, the Mahatma Gandhi Act, the program MG Narega, that's the name. Again, a bit of a comparative question, because there's an increasing debate on well, particularly among the global South and countries that are far from full employment, and even, I would say, not only with high rates of informality, but with a very stabilized rate of unionization or increase of the levels of formality. At least that is the case of Argentina, and it's a country that has tackled some of these issues within the region. We don't have the rates of informality Peru has, for instance. And we had something very different but similar in nature to MG Narega, and it was very much discussed on whether that type of social protection initiatives were actually enclosing or generating or reinforcing tendencies crossed by race and ethnicity in pockets of people that ultimately stayed like trapped within those systems, right? As I'm talking about the case of Argentina, but the question is on the type of approach, whether social protection actually does not create and reinforces patterns of racial and ethnic and caste segmentation. I very much agree with what you were saying. And my question is on how we can increase levels of unionization so that those that are mostly in the informal sector can cross the line, which in my reading is also a line of color and probably caste for the case of India. So my question is, do you think that MG Narega has actually reinforced patterns of race and caste discrimination? As in my understanding, I think they even have a caste or ethnic quota approach. So has, in your experience or in your knowledge, has MG Narega helped or contributed to cross the border of race and caste and ethnicity discrimination?
Sorry, thank you, Nico. Just to ask, Lira, is that a related question before I ask Archana to answer?
No, not related question, but perhaps after responding to Nico, I mean, because we're also approaching the end, but do I understand correctly, Archana, that basically you're saying within capitalism, we cannot really expect discrimination to be addressed in any meaningful way, because capitalism itself creates the conditions for the discrimination and reinforces those conditions, if I understand correctly your argument. So if you could just, I mean, of course, you're pointing at social protection can help, increasing union bargaining power and so on, but ultimately, do we see the two as kind of coexisting permanently? Capitalism and discrimination. Thank you.
So thank you for both the questions. Both the questions are good. First of all, I want to say about MNREGS that it's not a universal social protection program. So we cannot equate it with a universal social protection program. It is aimed at people below the poverty line to be able to survive. Being able to survive. So therefore, it becomes targeted as particular sections of society because they're more poor than others, firstly. Yeah. So it's more like a class-based program. And even in that, able-bodied workers who can get higher wages by migrating or doing other things, even even by migrating or anything, generally would not prefer MNREGS. Yeah, because its wage rates are lower than what a person could get on a daily basis. That's number one. And that's why the fight has been to increase the wage rates of MNREGS and expand the days of employment, expand it to different districts. Okay? So MNREG is very important so that people can eat and live. Yeah? But it's not aimed at tackling the problem of uneven distribution. It is only providing a bandage to a problem that is only deepening. And now the public investment in it is coming down. So I don't actually agree with the proposition that it will deepen discrimination because it is only implementable in areas which are already deprived. Will if they move, will that discrimination go? No, because the jobs have dried up. So they're going to die if they move. They're not going to, we're talking about reinforcing discrimination or a trap in a situation where people have a choice, and where the distinction is reinforced. Now you have point where actually people from all races, classes, and castes are slogging for MNREGS because they have no other option. Now, will that MNREGS also be discriminatory in its way? It may be in the way in which the local institution functions, because ultimately the provisioning of job is through the local institution, the local government. So if the local government is dominated by a certain section of society, the most deprived section may anyway not get jobs in it. So these are issues which are still coming up and which have to be addressed, but they can only be addressed if it is a universally applied program. If it's not a universally applied program, they cannot be addressed. Now, to Edvira's very difficult question, see, we know that capitalism coexists and deepens discrimination. But as social activists and organizers, we also know that discrimination can only be abolished if we change the consciousness of the working class. Where both things are together. Both things are together. How do you fight through organization that discrimination should go if the working class itself has internal contradictions within it? So the job of a trade union is not simply to extend wages, but also to develop a class consciousness, and to fight against all forms of social discrimination, which in many classical revolutionary far-left ideologies were called social reform. But in our experience, social reform strategies have to form the basis of class unity, yeah, which will form the basis of an anti-discriminatory politics as well, and therefore pressurize the state to implement the provisions it has for non-discrimination. Yeah, that's one issue. So that's one thing that unions and others have to continue to do. By the way, now there is also moves for organizing MNREGS workers. Yeah, but you see, the problem is that when you have a disinvestment in a factory system and people are working from home, then the trade unions will also have to work like other organizations, women's organizations, caste, agricultural workers organizations and other organizations. They will also have to work in place of residence, not only in place of work. Yeah. And once they start working in place of residence, they'll also have to confront institutions which capital uses to recreate the contradictions within the working class. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is it exists, but the will and the, for want of a better word, the agency to transform it will have to come from the people themselves, because capital is not going to do it for you. Capital is not going to do it. And that can only come when you build a consciousness amongst your own cadre and people that such discrimination is not acceptable, and it will not be accepted even in the social sphere of your existence. So without that, why should capital remove the discrimination? It's only benefiting from it. That initiative has to come from the people, the organic intellectuals of that, of our extremely complex working class. You have to, so that's the way I see it, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Archana, for that. Yeah. So I guess we might hit the time for one final question. So do I see any? If none, maybe this, Archana, as a last. You mentioned that the working class will have to like raise its consciousness and combat wage discrimination. Do you know of any like initiatives among unions basically to fight wage discrimination in its various forms? Or if not in unions, in, for example, countries that have undergone social change. I don't know if it has any been done in Cuba, for example, or even in the former Soviet Union that were effective in terms of fighting wage discrimination. So yeah, maybe a short answer before we close the workshop. Oh, you're still muted.
Or Kerala, he's asking.
Or Kerala, yeah. So
see,
thank you for that, Nico.
See, actually, what I feel is that in states and places, I mean, you may still have persistent discrimination of different kinds, but in states and places where you have fostered a pluralistic culture in order to overcome the solidification of rigid identities, yeah, in those places, and you have fostered equitable distribution of services. In those places, I feel perhaps discrimination may be a little lesser. You see, but you will see countries like India and all, I mean, they are very complex countries. They don't have homogeneity in populations. They don't have other kinds of things. I don't know, perhaps Latin America is also that complex. Yeah, but we have had in many places multi movements for the rights of so-called indigenous people, in quotes I'm putting, because that's a particular way in which they're described, where you have movements where the indigenous people, or the tribals as the government calls them, and those who are not from those social groups forge organizations together and fight. Now, they're not only doing against wage discrimination, but they are fighting for the rights of workers that also removes wage discrimination. And in certain small areas, historically speaking, also they've achieved some success. For example, the tribal area in which I wrote an oral history was primarily for removal of wage, for getting decent, fair wage. Yeah. The strike was not that only of the tribal people, but the majority of the workers were tribal in that. And that received a lot of support from different quarters. So what I'm trying to basically say is that we got to ourselves think of having even social politics or social identities that are, whose social basis is pluralistic and not particularistic. Yeah. So as a historian, I've documented quite a few examples of that. And one or two of my friends in Latin America have also documented some examples of that. But we should make that documentation a project that we should be undertaking. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you, Archana, for
And,
that.
and Kerala, by the way, discrimination is very less in Kerala, primarily because the social regulation is very high. The local self-governments are very progressive. The monitoring is very high. Even migrants don't face that kind of discrimination in Kerala. It's not an ideal state, but it's certainly, in terms of social discrimination, it's one of the more progressive states. Yes.
Yeah, so I think this is a very great discussion, so very interesting, and a lot of insights, a lot of ideas to think about, right? So on a personal level, when I first read about the caste system in India, I actually couldn't wrap my head around it, because I don't think there's anything really similar to where I come from, the Philippines. Although, of course, that doesn't mean there's really no contradictions across, because we have a Christian majority and a Muslim minority. So and that also that contradiction is also reflected in more poverty in Muslim areas, and also lower minimum wages in that. So I guess it's really, as Archana said, something that can be seen in all countries. So capitalism adapts and takes from the material it sees in every country. Yeah. So yeah, I guess with that, let's close the discussion. Again, thank you to Professor Archana for taking time to share her ideas about the topic for today. Okay. And of course, thank you to all our participants who attended.